Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and today we have Menno Henselmans and Mike Israetel on the podcast. Unfortunately, Eric hopefully might turn up a bit later and kind of put his input, but we are doing Individualization Part 2. Individualization Part 1, I really enjoyed personally, and I know you guys will have enjoyed it as well. But there are a few elements that I think would be worth covering, and I know Mike particularly wanted to cover as well. So without further ado, I'll let Mike start off with volume landmarks and individualizing those, and then let Menno kind of respond.
Yeah, thanks for having us on again, Steve. I will tolerate my just revulsion and hatred of Menno for another hour for you. I think that the two most important landmarks to talk about, there's others, specifically maintenance volume is the other. I won't talk about much here, I don't think, though we can. I think it's just important to hit the two big ones, minimum effective volume and maximum recoverable volume. And I think this is especially really pertinent based on the recent literature inclusions we've seen, like the recently released 45 sets per week quad study, and the recent resurgence of the debate about exactly how much more hypertrophy does additional volume give you, so on and so forth. Because what we tend to see is, they'll train 40 undergraduates at a university in a particular style, usually untrained or trained, which means they have a year of training experience, which is comical. And they'll train all of them with either one or two volumes, maybe three sometimes, and then they'll be like, here's kind of what's going on. And people seem to be interested in taking those volumes and just sort of copying them verbatim to their routines. The thing is something that I think James Krieger likes to point out a lot, is that, those are averages, and if you zoom in onto what the people in the study, the results each individual got, there's always a normal distribution about each volume, right? So there's like almost always a guy in the 5 set per week group that grows double the muscle of at least one guy in the 15 per week set group. Like, that's always going to happen. So you zoom in on the individual level, and then because this is a talk about individualization, we have to understand the volume landmarks. They're super easy to get. Minimum effective volume is the least amount of volume you can do is meaningfully progress, get bigger. And then maximum recoverable is the most you can recover with regularly. So training over that is just simply some combination of unproductive and impossible. And you just gotta, it's beyond the scope of this debate to say whether you should move from one to the other over a mesocycle. I think that's a fine idea, but it's not mandatory. You can just stay in the middle and move intensity. I think that's totally fine. But basically, like, where that middle is for you, it really does depend on individual differences, and where someone's middle is, where their ranges are, could be non-overlapping. Like, there's some people who have a minimum effective volume of 5 sets per week and a maximum recoverable of 15. Some other people will have a maximum recoverable of 16, a minimum effective of 16, and then a maximum recoverable of 40. So if they were training partners and they did the same workout, one person would get fucked one way or the other, right? Either one guy just have no gains, or the other guy's just chronically overreach, deload. So I think my sort of last thing I'll say before I hand it off to Menno is do some semblance. You don't have to go through the formal process of finding your volume landmarks. Just start training. I would recommend doing MEV first. Start training just not much and see if you still make progress. Because if you do, that's awesome, right? You just found the golden ticket. And if you're not making great progress, you feel like you're barely even lifting, do a bit more, and sort of over the months and maybe even longer, push up your volume to a place where you kind of feel like, okay, this is unsustainable, sort of MRV-ish. And then you kind of have an understanding of where your ranges are, and it is per muscle group. And then and then you don't have to fucking do any kind of idiocy. Like, if someone invited me, I know my MRV for back is like roughly 16 to 18 compound sets, per week. If someone's like, hey, you want to do this workout, just 30 sets for back? I would just outright be like, no, that's fucking stupid for me, right? Or if someone's like, hey, you get great growth doing 5 sets per week for back, I'd just be like, yeah, this is false, right? So if you find your own landmarks, you can spare all of the bullshit and of cookie cutter programs and really just give yourself the best advantage and save yourself from a lot of injury and unfortunate things down the road.
Brilliant. And I guess, Menno, have you seen very similar things in regards to volume landmarks where they're quite different for different individuals and kind of there are people off the bell curve of that average?
Definitely. Also gender differences, some differences are systemic, like I think in the last podcast we also talked about women generally having like a couple sets at least higher volume tolerance than men. But some are they're not random, but we cannot observe them, so they seem random to us, and that they're just how many satellite cells someone has. We have no idea, so unless you've done a biopsy in every muscle you have, then you don't know, and you just have to experiment to find out. And I think the two most pertinent studies on this, I'm not sure if we covered them last time, are the Bevan study and Koglu et al. And they basically found the same thing. Koglu et al. Found that both how many reps per set you tolerate best and the set volume depend on your ACE genotype, which it correlates a lot with how many fast twitch muscle fibers you have. So if you're, they found roughly, because it was a bit limited by statistical power, but there was a strong trend that if you have more like sprinter type genes, then you didn't really benefit from the increase in sets, but you did benefit a lot from higher intensities. Whereas if you had more the endurance genes, then you did benefit from extra sets, and actually they seem to respond better to the higher amounts of reps per set. So it's both volume and maybe even how many reps per do if you're better suited towards more endurance or strength. And the Bevan study was in rugby players, and that's one of my favorite studies of all time probably. And that they put people, they first did a test workout, which was like traditional power workout, 3 sets of 5 at 70% or something like that. Strength workout, which was like 3 sets of 5 at 85%. And hypertrophy workout, which was like 4 sets of 10 at 70%. Something like that. I don't know the exact details, but they first did a test workout and then interestingly tested their salivary testosterone response to see which workout they had the highest amount of testosterone production to and the lowest. So the people that had they then divided the people, the rugby players, into the workout that they responded the best to or the worst, and then they crossed them over, so they crossed over design to the other one. And they found that when you put people on the best workout, which actually varied a lot per individual, most people respond the best to the hypertrophy workout. They gained more mass and more strength. They didn't measure muscle mass, unfortunately, but just body mass and strength. And when they put them on the worst workout, most of them just maintained, some even regressed. And if you look at the chart of where people respond best, it's actually pretty amazing in that most people respond best to the hypertrophy and the strength workouts, but some people actually respond the best to the power workouts or the endurance workouts. And they also gain more strength and, based on body mass at least, more muscle with the power or the endurance workout than the strength for the hypertrophy workout. And that's just crazy, which, I've never seen anyone that responded well in terms of hypertrophy to power work. There's just never. So I'm not sure if there's really anything there other than that maybe that these people just have a very, very low volume tolerance. And they were probably doing other work on top of that. I think they were in season, not quite sure. But I think it's more volume tolerance. So, based on the study, I wouldn't put anyone on a power workout because other than the super odds freak genetic outlier, I don't think that will work for anyone, but it's just crazy to see how big the inter-individual variability can be, even in scientific research.
Brilliant. And when we're thinking about these elements and we're talking about kind of minimum effective volume, that's probably a good place to start, assess your recovery and how your performance is going, and maybe move forward from there rather than starting with too much. I think something that I think would be brilliant for you guys to cover is there's no doubt lots of people who are doing far too much and they're kind of worried to scale back. I don't know if one of you would particularly like to cover this scenario in which someone is doing lots and lots of volume and it's not productive. It's probably over their MRV and they're actually doing lots of junk volume.
I mean, I can start with that if you'd like. The number one fear I've heard reported by those folks is, I feel like if I scale back, I'll lose muscle. So I'm going to address that from a couple of perspectives. First of all, if you're overworking and you reduce the volume of work, within a week, your glycogen will reload if you change nothing, and you'll feel the biggest you've ever been. Second of all, your fatigue will fall off, and you'll be the strongest you've ever been. So within several weeks, you're going to just feel unbelievable. Secondly, we know quite well from converging lines of evidence that unless you are a rank beginner, and then for sure you shouldn't be doing 30 sets per week or whatever, maintenance volume is almost always and everywhere much lower than maximum recoverable volume. Something like, man, a third is what I've seen with most people that I've worked with, and that's charitable. So, if your MRV is 18 sets per week, your maintenance volume might be 6 sets per week, especially if you modulate intensity appropriately. So when people say, I'm going to lose mass if I cut my volume, motherfucker, you're going to have to cut your volume to less than a third. No one's saying that. We're saying maybe, I don't know, Menno, what do you think? Cut it by half and see where it goes? Almost certainly you won't go below your maintenance volume. And here's another just last final thought from the great wisdom of Greg Nuckols and all of his sort of summaries. Regaining previously gained musculature is profoundly easy. So if we really fuck you up, you can just go back to these retarded volumes and all of a sudden you're huge again. So it's just kind of like a training break. The best athletes in the world, Eastern Europeans, Chinese, so on and so forth, take months per year off or in low volume training phases and come back to win the Olympics. So this idea that you're going to go from 20 sets a week down to 15, and you look in the mirror and all of a sudden you're falling off your gaunt face, you look like a fucking cancer patient, is utter, total reverse logic nonsense, Menno.
Definitely. I think, especially for people that are doing that much volume, and I think a lot of people, you're talking about people that are probably prone to obsession in terms of how badly they want to train, and if they're going to miss a workout, it's the end of the world. The risk of overtraining and losing muscle simply because you're exceeding your recovery capacity and you're breaking down more muscle than you can rebuild is probably actually greater than the risk of losing muscle when you're decreasing the volume, especially because these people also often don't really do light training. So even if they're only doing a couple sets, that it's probably only a matter of gaining less. If you're maintenance, a third is indeed, as you said, charitable. I think in my experience, maintenance is two full body workouts per week. That suffices for most people, I think. And 3 is definitely already on the point where you can gain. So I think for many people, maintenance is extremely easy. And the risk of not gaining at all or losing muscle mass, that only happens if you take complete time off completely from working out.
Perfect. And I think, Oh, sorry, Mike.
Sorry, real quick, Menno touched on something, and I love that he always brings it's very accusatory psychology into this, which I think is awesome and hilarious and very true. Obsessive is an interesting term to use. I think some people need exercise for a sort of catharsis, they need it to sublimate other shit, and it's got to go somewhere. And if they don't train a lot and beat the shit out of themselves, they don't feel normal. And I say that because I'm one of those people. I just happen to add, jiu-jitsu as a hobby to fill that void in my life. But I can totally sympathize with it. But I think it's important for folks like that, the intelligent ones anyway, because most of the folks are, that even want to listen to this kind of thing are very smart, to back up and be like, okay, am I really rationally thinking there's an expectation of muscle loss? Or are my demons just being don't stop, don't stop? You guys know what I mean? It's clearly the latter. And if you are introspective, and then you're well, I'm just being obsessive,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, for me, so for those that don't know, I'm a digital nomad, which means I live in a different country pretty much on a monthly basis. And it's only in the last year or so that I actually really came to terms with the idea that if I have an international flight that lasts a whole day and I'm going to arrive in, Valencia, I'm going there Saturday on, 11 in the evening, then it might actually not be necessary to immediately go to a gym or do a hotel workout, and I can actually take a day off. So that's just completely counter to my intuitions. And I think there is definitely value in just having the mindset that you are going to work out. And especially during contest prep and stuff, for many people, it's the opposite, right? They make too many excuses. But there is a point where, indeed, like Mike says, you have to just rationally consider the pros and cons of doing another workout or increasing or decreasing the volume. Because there is a point where it's just too much and might even be counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, the only additional point I wanted to say is, just because the audience might be thinking it, is when we're talking about maintenance, and maintenance volume can be quite low, we're also talking about maintenance of calorie intake, just because I think people will then be like, oh, is that right? I can diet and not hardly train.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah, if you're going to be in energy deficit or a lot of deficit, then you have to do more training than just your maintenance, because you're basically no longer, when you're in energy maintenance, your body is just at the point where it needs a very little stimulus not to break down that muscle tissue. But when you add an energy deficit, there is now a competing stimulus for catabolism. So the body has a stimulus to break down tissue, and the only consideration it needs is what type of tissue it's going to break down. And there is, especially if you're lean and highly muscular, it is very tempting for the body to break down that highly metabolically active muscle tissue instead of the adipose tissue, of which we don't have that much, and is just pretty much inert in terms of metabolic activity, at least in terms of energy expenditure. So then you definitely have to ramp up the volume a bit, otherwise you are at risk of losing muscle mass.
Yeah.
Great. And I don't know if Menno, you want to continue to talk about frequency and individualizing that to anyone.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I'm known as a high frequency guy, which is fairly accurate, I guess. I'm not, a lot of people take a look at what some of my clients have achieved or something, and they're like, Menno does full body every day. And I do that, but not that many of my clients actually do that. So I use high frequency programming in some clients that I think can tolerate it. And I think by far the best gauge of if you want to do a high frequency program is how much volume do you have. So you pretty much have a volume tolerance, your MRV, and then you're looking at how are you going to distribute that across the week. And if your MRV is like 50 sets, then I think you're going to have a very hard time fitting that in with any quality on Monday. So in that case, for 50 sets, then, and you have 7 training days, then I think I would probably put almost anyone on full body training, because you're talking about 7 sets per day even then. And that's pretty hardcore. So I just don't see any way of fitting that volume in with any good quality in any other setup. But if your MRV is like 15 sets and that person is doing 3 workouts per week and has a very hard time fitting in a 4th one due to work or logistics or whatever, then probably just stick with 3 workouts. So the first consideration is definitely volume. And I think frequency, there aren't really that many other considerations than volume. I think many things actually affect volume, and by that also affect the optimal training frequency, or just the practical distribution of that volume over time, which is what frequency is. And I think there isn't really something that makes someone respond that much better to a given frequency given a certain volume.
So, Mike, I don't know if you've got a bit of a different perspective, I believe, to frequency, a bit more than just divvying up volume, I think.
Yeah, that's like everything Menno said, I think is absolutely, I can agree with. I would say that additional consideration for frequency starts to develop from, a lot of what he said. It's like volume per session. If you do low volumes per session, you need more sessions. If you do high volumes per session, you can get away with lower frequencies and get, I think, a similar result. I think there are some interesting things that happen when you get really, really big and really, really strong, or bigger and stronger and more experienced. And on the downside, when you start to accumulate a history of injuries, there's a couple of things to that effect. One is, I think, as you get all of those things, it can take a while to warm up, longer than normal. And once you're warm, you're fucking golden, but it takes like a fucking while, 30 minutes or something. So if you have a really high frequency program and it takes you half an hour to warm up for squats, maybe you could just do 2 or 3 sessions a week as opposed to doing it every day, because then you're just pissing away a ton of time. Is there some efficiency? Is there some effectiveness enhancement for more frequent squatting? Technically, yes, but there's a huge efficiency downside from that extra warm-up time. So, like, once you are warmed up for squats, you might as well hit leg presses because you're cutting the warm-up time on those by a ton. But if you don't, if you just do those, squats one day, then leg presses the next, and squats one day, then leg presses the next, there's a lot more warm-up time involved there. So I think some body parts, especially for bigger, stronger folks, like once you're already in, do some good damage there, do some good justice to them. Another one is, I think that for a lot of folks, there is some amount of volume that is so much that we start to get into junk volume problems in a single session. And also the damage to stimulus ratio starts to become unfavorable. For example, if someone asked you, how do I train my legs every 2 weeks and still grow? The technical answer would be to take their, MEV to MRV, take the average set numbers, 15 per week, double that because it's every 2 weeks, and be like, well, you're going to have to do a workout that's 30 sets every 2 weeks. Nobody would ever say that because it's fucking insane, and it would lead to either suboptimal growth or death. I don't know. I've never done a 30-set quad workout. I don't plan on it. The super sort of extreme analogy is getting hit by a car once every month and you'll be huge. There's a ton of damage. It's been shown fairly convincingly so far that, and it's theoretically aligns perfectly, that a certain amount of damage actually competes with muscle growth, right? You have to make room for adaptation, and if you take all of your adaptive proclivity and piss it away on healing yourself, then there's not much left to actually get you better. So case in point, I think if we take that quads every 2 week analogy and say, well, that's stupid. Well, you take a female's cross-sectional area for bicep and the load she's using for curls. It's the same thing if you're saying she should have a bicep day. Oh, great. Her MRV is going to be like 40 sets, right? Average 35 sets per week, right? Per program. Go ahead and give her a bicep day, 1 day a week, 35 fucking bicep sets. What is she going to be lifting by the end of it? Her fucking hands, right? Like, that's insane. First of all, it's tons of junk volume. We run into those problems. Second of all, it's you're going to cause a lot more damage than you do growth, so to speak, or just way more damage than you need. It's people say, like, well, as long as the volume is equated, the frequency doesn't matter. Per week, that becomes close to the truth for many things, but not all things. Per half week, it becomes very close to true. But technically speaking, you can parse it out even further. I think if you're female and you want bigger arms, training your arms any less than 3 sessions a week just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the amount of sort of fractional synthetic rate the amount of volume you'd have to train per session to get the fractional synthetic rate up to maximum or really high is just ungodly. And then you're creating so much muscle damage, the FSR is muted to begin with. So hopefully you guys can see where I'm going with this. I think for smaller individuals, for females specifically, high frequency programming or higher frequencies are just plain old better if we just figure out what I like to call SRA curves, the stimulus recovery adaptation. There's only so far they can reasonably be stretched out and still equate the total area under the curve. You can't train legs once a month. Nobody thinks that. You can't train them every 2 weeks. That's not optimal. So why the fuck are we training female biceps once a week? That's nonsense. And I've actually had multiple clients back in the day when I was coaching, females that, they just train with their boyfriends or something, and they don't want to do that anymore because their results aren't that great. And I'm like, how many days a week do you do shoulders? And they're like, once. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, you guys ever seen a side delt on a female? It's like the size of your pinky. But thinking how much force is it producing? It could heal every 12 hours or something. Like you could probably 2-a-day train side delts for females and you get optimum results. So I think, if you're really big, really strong, I think you may be able to benefit fine from once a week hard muscle group training, even though a higher frequency approach might still be better for you. I think you get decent gains like that because it just takes you so fucking long to recover and you grow, your fractional cellular rate curve spikes so much that it makes sense. But for females, there's not even the recovery thing. Like you can pound a female with volume for delts or biceps or even legs sometimes. And like 2 days later, you're like, how are you feeling? Super fucked up. And they're like, I'm completely fine. You're like, Jesus, like, why are we waiting? There is no reason to wait at that point. It's time to hit it again. So I think that the higher frequency stuff really, really comes to play there, where it's like the way we judge it at RP is sort of like if you did another workout, would your performance be overloading? Yes. Are you currently sore in either connective tissues or muscles? No. It's time to train again, probably. Like it's an average value, but there's a lot of wisdom to that. And I think if you use that rule and try to train people who recover fast once a week, that's kind of nuts, and sometimes even 2 times a week is nuts. So I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing that you touched on is really important with the frequency literature, and that is that the vast majority of it is volume equated. And that is never the case in practice. So if you are looking at sets equated, then you are looking at the recent meta-analyses of Greg Knuckles, which even to me are surprisingly clearly in favor of higher frequency training. He basically found that all the way pretty much linearly, it was like 22% extra growth per training session per muscle group, all the way up to at least 6 sets. And from the limited research, there is maybe even 7 workouts, which is daily training, which is pretty insane if you then look at what the difference is between the bro split and training and muscle group every day. Mm-hmm. But in the literature that's work equated, you're not just talking about 20 sets of biceps curls performed on either Monday or spread across the week. You're talking about a given volume of work. And like Mike said, when you do 20 sets of biceps curls on Monday, your last set of biceps curls, when you've done squat curls, preacher curls, barbell curls, and you're going to do dumbbell curls, what's your work capacity at that point? It's 0. I mean, you're not going to be able to perform. You're not going to be able to lift much weight or perform a lot of repetitions with any given weight. So if you spread out those sessions across the week, your total work actually goes up a lot. And it's more the more exercises you have in a given session. So if you take someone's like bro split with all exercises for a given muscle group, all performed on one single day, you spread that out, volume is going to increase very substantially. So that's going to have a very different training effect. Not necessarily because of the difference in frequency, but at least because of the difference in volume. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely a consideration with frequency.
The only question I have to this is, are we in agreement that there's a minimum effective volume then for the week, or is there potentially any kind of avenues for minimum effective for a given muscle group for a session? Is there a certain amount of disruption or volume you need to do in one workout for it to be like an actual workout?
I definitely think in more advanced folks, the latter is a realistic thing. I think for a lot of beginners, the latter is not a realistic thing, a minimum effective training session, because one set is minimum effective for very, very many people. But if you were to look at it this way, if your minimum effective volume is, let's say, 14 sets a week on something, which is not unreasonable for folks that have been training a very long time, if you train 1 set per session, 7 days a week, there's no way around that. You're just not going to be able to hit it. If you train 2, you're going to be able to hit it. So basically the weekly volume ends up being so low that it's just maintenance volume. Like you just need to do more shit, and it doesn't even matter how you split it up at that point. It's just the fact that it's not enough. So by that avenue, a minimum effective volume per session is definitely reality, just by that avenue. There's some potential other avenues. Here's one. When we're looking at the causative factors for muscle growth, it's been made pretty clear that cell swelling is definitely one of them. And that, the pump, so to speak, right? The thing is, beginner athletes can get a really good pump from a set, 2 sets. A lot of more advanced athletes don't get their best pumps until multiple sets into a program. So I think that can play into the hypertrophy equation. And even if you equate for tension over the course of the week, I think the degree of pumpedness you get can play a role. And I think that at least has another avenue of it. Another one is the following. With more advanced athletes especially, you get a cross-set potentiating effect, where one set you lift and it feels good and stuff like that. Mind-muscle connection's decent. We know mind-muscle connection probably plays a role in hypertrophy to some small extent. And the volume load's good, and if you went back and rested and came back again, it would be good performance. I think there is an effect where if you do like 2 or 3 sets per session, per muscle group, that it actually goes better every single set. Every set is more stimulative. And because fatigue has an influence on fiber recruitment, the more fatigued you become, the more fibers are recruited that are more fast twitch, large motor unit. I think what ends up happening is if you do one set of bench and it's to failure, let's say it's just all the sets are to failure, just keep things simple. You end up recruiting the faster twitch fibers towards the end, which is good. But then the total amount of recruitment time, the total amount of damage or whatever, you forget damage, stimulus that they're receiving is it's not that great. If you do that for 3 sets, it starts to become really good, not because there's just 3 more sets, but because the muscles are that much more fatigued and the faster twitch fibers have to kick in that much earlier. So basically, if you bias your training to a super duper high frequency, you end up loading your connective tissues a lot. You put a shitload of weight on the bar, but from a pure hypertrophy standpoint, of that Berge myoreps kind of situation where you intentionally make yourself tired, so to speak, so that you can get more juice out of the muscles. I mean, no one's advocating that for getting as strong as possible. You're strong, you rest, right? But on the other hand, there's that factor. And I think the more volume load situation for beginners and intermediates cancels out all those benefits pretty much. But I think as you get really, really advanced, I think some of them become a little bit more prominent to where I could see basically making an argument that if someone was 100 kilos, super strong, lean, having them train something like their back or their chest or their quads any more than 4 sessions a week, each session either becomes very pulsatile, like some sessions are very hard, some are very not hard, which begs the question of why do you even have the easy one at all? Or all the sessions tend to just be like you asked them, how are the pumps? They're how's your muscle activation? I feel like I'm warming up and then I kind of do stuff and then I have to leave. Am I confident that that is exactly the way it works? No, but I'm confident that accounts for much of the variance that we see in real world programming versus theoretical programming, and probably why a lot of bodybuilders stick to the lower frequency range when they're jacked. The problem is when everyone does that, they always do low frequency, they get shitty results, and the results sort of kind of get better as they get bigger and stronger to the freaky end. So I think that might explain it to some extent. Also, from Greg Knuckles' analysis, it was shown, I believe, that the more experience somebody had, I think the stronger they were, maybe, was it one of them? The more experience, the larger the body part, so to speak, upper body versus legs. And I think the gender effect pointed in the direction of less of an advantage for higher frequency for all of those. So females get more out of high frequency than males. Bigger muscles like the legs get a little bit less out of high frequency than upper body muscles. And then people with experience get a little bit less out of high frequency than people with less experience, which to me makes a whole lot of sense. And I think, the experienced people in those studies are 1 to 3 years of training. I think if you take 7 years of training or 10 years of training, I think there's legitimate block-offs too. You can get great results with 7 days a week training, but if you want your super best results, I think maybe some of the muscle groups, either you can totally train 7 days a week, it's just not all of them are going to be really hard days. But if you ask the question of how many true overloading sessions, I think it starts to look like maybe 3 and 4, maybe 2 for really big body parts. And if your chest is Marcus Rules, where he's inclining 230 kilos for reps, I think for him, honestly, 1 day a week of chest is it's all the fucking check marks, and there's no way to train chest remotely hard again because it just takes that long to heal. So there's my rant on the subject.
Menno, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me have two things. One is the the original question, which is what was the original question?
Is there a minimum effective volume in a given
right, per week or per session? So if you had asked me this 2 years ago, maybe longer, then I would have definitely said per session, based on the literature on muscle protein synthesis, which is quite convincing that muscle protein synthesis just doesn't last that long after workouts. There's actually one workout study in bodybuilders that does like 9 sets of biceps work to failure, and then 33 hours later, it's pretty much at baseline muscle protein synthesis. So there is some debate about this, most literature being about mixed total. So mixed is basically the same as total muscle protein synthesis, and it's not protein fraction specific. And what we're really mostly concerned with for muscle growth is myofibrillar protein synthesis. But mixed protein synthesis includes myofibrillar protein synthesis. So assuming measurement validity, you would expect that as mixed protein synthesis reaches baseline, myofibrillar protein synthesis must also have reached baseline. But there is actually one study where this is not the case. So there's where they found that myofibrillar protein synthesis is still elevated, but mixed protein synthesis is no longer elevated. Now that has to be some measurement error, that the specific ratios are in, nice shot, that the specific ratios are within measurement error. Otherwise, that's just not possible. But anyway, based on that, you would expect that there's a minimum volume per session, and frequency is really important. But over the recent years, there have been a lot of studies that show that even very advanced lifters can make remarkably good progression with just one workout per week. So those suggest that, or they strongly show that volume is the primary determinant of growth, not training frequency. And even suggest very strongly that as long as you're doing a volume per session, you can have very effective workouts with just one session per week. And in terms of maintenance, I think definitely almost anyone can maintain training a muscle group just once a week. Now, probably at that point, you are at the point that you might actually be losing a little muscle mass just before the next training session, before that muscle group. But you probably want to turn off the camera.
Sorry, is that my dick show, or are we good?
It was a nice crotch shot.
Thank you.
But what was I saying?
The one
the answer to that is, in practical terms, one session per week. You can think of maintenance as like a weekly requirement because it's just so low, and it's definitely possible with one session per week. The other point, which Mike touched on, which is really interesting, going back to individualization and the rule of who responds best to higher frequencies. And indeed, Greg's meta-analysis found these three points, and they were supported as well by another meta-analysis on strength. They did not study hypertrophy, unfortunately, but basically finding that the lower body does not seem to respond as well as the upper body to increased frequency. It's very tricky, I think, to whether that depends on muscle size, maybe. I mean, most studies are about the quads versus the biceps, or maybe the triceps. So it could be muscle size, but it might also have something to do inherently with the fact that you're walking on your lower body. There is definitely something going on there. There's also studies showing differences in volume response. Some studies actually suggest that the lower body needs more volume. So, but there have also been 2 studies that tried to replicate that finding and found no difference between the upper and the lower body. So it's very difficult to say if that's something that's truly there in a meta-analysis, or if it's confounded by study design, because you're basically aggregating a lot of different data with a lot of different studies with different variables, and it's very likely that when you do this, you end up invariably having differences between the frequencies that you did not intend. Like most studies that have a frequency of twice a week in trained lifters will use something like an upper-lower split, whereas most frequencies that, or studies that have like a 3 times frequency will be full body. So there you have the difference in that you're doing full body workouts 3 times a week versus upper lower splits, which have actually an extra training day, for example, and which aren't full body, they are splits. So you have these differences between the frequencies of 2 and 3, and you can have many more differences like that in the literature as well. If you're looking at like super high frequencies, the only studies that have really looked at super high frequencies, they're pretty much all in very trained individuals. So that's also the second point, like, do trained individuals respond less well to a higher frequency? Theoretically, you would expect that trained individuals respond better, I think, because they have a shorter anabolic window, the duration of muscle protein synthesis is shorter than in untrained individuals. They recover faster, they don't suffer as much muscle damage, and they recover from metabolic stress better. So based on these factors, you would think they actually need that very frequent muscle stimulation. But the meta indeed suggested that the trend is in the opposite direction. Now, if you actually look at all the individual studies, this trend definitely does not emerge, because if you're looking at untrained individuals, there is one study that finds a significant benefit of higher training frequencies than just once a week. There are like 8 studies that look at 1 versus 3 frequencies, no difference. Now they show up in the meta, but when a meta shows something is significant, but you're looking at 7 versus 1 split or something, and that one study was Ochi et al. From 2018. It was only strength and no difference between muscle growth. So is there really something there then? There might be a trend, it might be statistical power, and the meta-analysis picked it up better, but I don't know, when you're looking at trained individuals, there are like 5 studies or something that find significant benefits, and or maybe it's probably 3 or 4 that find significant benefits, but a lot that find trends. So if you're just looking at trained and untrained individuals, you just look at all the individual studies, then I think the trend is definitely in favor of the more trained group. But if you look at the meta that aggregates everything, it seems to be that the response is diminished in the trained versus untrained individuals. We had the same thing in our meta-analysis on protein intake, which actually found that trained individuals respond better to increased protein intake. Now, theoretically, you would expect that they respond more poorly because they have less protein breakdown and less protein synthesis. And several studies have indeed found that protein needs decrease along with training age. So there, we also have this discrepancy in results, and that the meta suggests as you get more advanced, you need more protein, but the individual literature and the mechanistic literature that actually looks at cause and effect suggests that over time your protein needs decrease, somewhat at least. So I'm very skeptical of placing too much faith in these specific findings of the meta, and that there might not be anything there, and that there is contrasting literature. The one on gender, though, gender is pretty much uncontested, I think. Pretty much all the literature points in the direction of women just tolerating more volume, more frequency, shorter rest periods, more everything, pretty much.
More intensity too.
Well,
they can survive more intensity and not necessarily benefit from it, but any intensity that a woman can survive, relative intensity, a male will may not survive. Whether or not they benefit more is a little bit up for grabs.
Right. Yeah. So it's more stress, pretty much, from the intensity. Mm-hmm. And so that one's pretty uncontested. Muscle groups and training status, very contentious, I think. So that's why overall, I think it's mainly just volume, and that determines the optimal frequency, but definitely very interesting to see more research coming out on this, because I think we're getting to that level now in the literature. We have people keep pumping out studies on different training frequencies. It's still contested. Is there a benefit or not? So it's great, but I think it would be nice to move on to the level where we're not just comparing different frequencies, but we're going to look at who responds better to those frequencies.
Perfect. Yeah. No, very interesting. I guess for the listeners, the biggest take home is consider your total volume. And then there's quite a lot of frequencies that work pretty well for most people. There's likely a practical implication of how many times you get to the gym. What's a realistic workout for you? Are you super strong? You probably don't want to be squatting every single day. So no, brilliantly covered, guys. And The next one, if we're good to go on that, and I don't know if Mike, you want to start off with talking about rep ranges and kind of individualization of rep ranges and what you might want to do with that in the context of hypertrophy.
Totally. So we can leave the discussion of periodization maybe for a later date or maybe for never, because there inevitably a question will arise as well. Maybe you should take specific periods to address certain repetition ranges and then put some on the back burner, so on and so forth. But let's just say we're designing one mesocycle. We want the most growth that we can out of that one mesocycle. And let's say we're training the whole body and we have sort of the power to train as much as we can recover from or need to. So then the question there becomes, where should we train with rep range? Now, we can, delineate anything less than 5 reps per set is probably a bad use of your time. Fatigue to stimulus ratio sucks. And then anything less than or less weight, more reps than 30 reps per set is a difficult, little more uphill argument. 30 to 40% of 1RM is kind of starts to get a little funky, and some studies show significantly less growth from less. Occlusion might be able to change that somewhat, so on and so forth. But I think it's not unreasonable to see a spectrum of rep ranges between 5 reps per set-ish and 30 reps per set-ish as being kind of the golden zone, as a much bigger zone than people have thought prior. And I think it's important, if you want maximum hypertrophy, to kind of attack all the general areas in that zone, because they're all going to probably represent, like Menno had cited the research earlier, different fiber types, at least in different, other growth proclivities for muscle fibers, design, architecture, so on and so forth. So if we look at it like that, then we have to train in all the rep ranges. The next question for individual difference comes up in, if you're splitting your, let's make it simple and say weekly workload, what percent of your work do you allocate towards what ranges? And I think there we have to go back to, again, what Menno had said of who responds best to what. And I think I would like to hear Menno's thoughts on how to determine that more from data and from measurement. I would like to sort of put forward a real-world bullshit educated guess guide as to how to do this in training. It's not the way to do it, it's just one. I'll say this. If you are training for hypertrophy, this is only for hypertrophy, if you are training a muscle with very heavy weights or certain weights that you consider heavy, closer to the 5 rep range, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that low, and you're feeling like your joints hurt, your sort of tendons hurt, you feel like the move is an act of like, I'm just trying not to get killed. And after the set or even multiple sets, people are like, hey, how did that feel? Like, I don't know, I didn't die, so that was good. It was painful and uncomfortable. And they're like, do you feel it in the muscle? And you're like, dude, I don't even know. I don't. No pump, nothing. And the only thing that happens is like the next day you wake up in bed and it's not that meaty soreness in the belly of the muscle. It's like a peripheral pain of like, ow, 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 like I can't get out of bed, my joints hurt. That's probably too heavy for that muscle to hypertrophy much. On the other hand, if you are doing on the higher end of repetitions and you feel like you're just moving weight around, and instead of getting a good pump and getting a feel in the muscle, you just feel tired. And the more sets you do, the more tired you feel. That might be for that muscle, not the most productive way to train. So I would say that leaves us with ranges where you should do most of your training that give you a really good pump, at least some kind of feel, and a sensation, a mind-muscle connection that you're actually doing something with that muscle and it's getting a hit. It's something that, we can describe in verbal terms, but people kind of know. Like you show someone how to high bar deep squat for the first time, and maybe doing half squats sumo, and they're like, I can never feel my quads. You do a set of 12 on the high bar, and you look at them, you're like, what do you think? They're like, fuck. You're like, do you feel the quads? And you're asking it rhetorically, and you're like, dude, fuck off. I don't even know what's going on. Like, hell yeah. Like it's all of my life's sins just went straight to my quads and I'm paying for them now, right? And it's not the knees, it's not the hips, it's the quads. So That's kind of like a real layman's way of being like, what's a productive way for me to do this? Let me give you just a quick example, and I'll let Menno in on this. So for me, my hamstrings tend to be probably more fast twitch than not. If I do sets, like leg curls, there's a little bit of exception because it actually doesn't take a lot of time to do a leg curl. So my fast twitch fibers can still get a lot of the work done even with higher reps. But like with good mornings or stiff-legged deadlifts, great exercises, by the way. If I do sets of like 14 or 15 or something, I just feel tired. I don't get super sore from that. Not a big pump in the hamstrings, not a feel. I'm just like, ah. If I do sets of 4, I'm like, ow, everything hurts and I can't get fucking connected to shit. I don't even know what I'm training. I think my tendons. But if I do like sets of 6 to 10, it's beautiful. Like I'm just all hamstring all the time. It feels great. Does that mean that I can only train hamstrings in sets of 6 to 10? No. I think that if I'm trying to get, or again, in one mesocycle, optimal hypertrophy, I think I can start the workout or within the week, do a little bit of my work in the 5 to 7 rep range, maybe like even as little as a set or 2. Maybe 60 to 70% of my work in that 6 to 12 range or whatever, that's real productive for me. And maybe a couple of drop sets at some point, maybe 20 or 30% of the work, maybe less, in the higher rep ranges, 15, 20, and maybe leave the 30 shit out completely or do like one set of that. So there's going to be a distribution and kind of like a normalized curve among your best rep ranges. And for some people, that curve will be flatter. For some people, it'll be more spiky. But I think that's how you should basically figure out what to train if you're just going by feel. But I think for the physiological realities that reflect that, I think Menno has a whole lot more insightful shit to say. And maybe he can correct me on anything I said.
Yeah, I think I use 2 factors that I think are at the center of this. One is the difference in strain on connective versus muscular tissue. So like you said, if you're doing very heavy weights in general, as you go higher in intensity and higher in repetitions and lower in intensity, so you're doing, say, sets of 30 and sets of 5, this greatly decreases the strain on connective tissues, notably your tendons. And the strain on muscle fibers is still very high as long as you're taking the set close to failure. So in general, the higher in reps you go, the more you alleviate the stress on your tendons while preserving stress for muscle growth. So definitely for rehab and prehab, that's very important. And prehab is when you're an advanced trainee and you are pushing your volume up to the limits of what your body can tolerate, you're pretty much prehabbing nonstop. I think that is one of the most underrated aspects of being an advanced trainee, is that you're always pushing up against the boundary of injury if you're not careful. So there's definitely a big argument there to use more higher rep work if you're doing a lot of volume, and leave the high intensity work bits for when it's really necessary, and do pretty much the minimum you need to have good strength development. Because you do need progressive overload and strength development probably. If you're not gaining any strength anymore, you can be rest assured that you're probably also, or you can actually rest assured that you're also not gaining any muscle mass. So you can gain strength but not muscle mass, but because of neural adaptations. But when you're not getting any strength, you are almost certainly not gaining any muscle mass. The only possible way that would be possible if you somehow had negative neural adaptations, but that's pretty much impossible if you are performing the movements that you are testing. So that's one consideration. The other consideration is inherently differences in muscle architecture, like muscle fiber type, which I became known for as my muscle-specific hypertrophy method. A lot of people have wrongly interpreted, and that I use higher or lower reps for certain muscle groups. But I've never actually just used arbitrary numbers. I have always used an intensity system. So rather than prescribe, say, sets of 8, I will prescribe an intensity of 80% and a proximity to failure. And I think the nice thing there, most research actually does this as well, but many coaches don't, is that you are autoregulating the volume based on that person's or that muscle's, more specifically, strength. So we have research pointing the Koglu study that I mentioned, in that people with the more sprinter ACE genes, which correlates with more fast twitch muscle fibers, don't seem to respond as well to higher volumes. And there's also a recent study, which is actually really cool, from this month, I think even, that there's a correlation between fast twitch fiber type composition, having more fast twitch fibers, and the neuromuscular fatigue in the days after high rep work. In other words, it suggests that if you have very fast twitch muscle fibers and you're doing high rep work, you're going to be fatigued as hell in the next days. So that's very much in line with what coaches have been, especially coaches of sprinters, have known for a very long time. David Epstein wrote a very nice chapter on this in his book, The Sports Gene, where he discusses research that sprinters, who are famous for having extremely fast twitch muscle fibers, respond extremely poorly often to higher volumes. So they just get injured, they don't recover well from it, and it doesn't really seem to add any training stimulus. So, that's speaking in extremes, and these are the genetic outliers. But there is probably somewhat of a trend there. And I think there are many more factors, not just muscle fiber type. Muscle fiber type is just the one we know most of. Capillary density. Some research suggests that capillary density is actually more influential in determining how many reps you can do at a given intensity. Yeah.
Capillary density relates to fiber type incredibly well, just to point that out. In part, the fiber type can have a huge relationship to capillary density, and fiber types, not only capillary density, fiber types differ by myoglobin content. So once you get the oxygen to them, fast fiber types are just not good at getting it anywhere within the muscle fiber, whereas slower fiber types are very good at getting it. So all very interrelated.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, it's not just muscle fiber type. There's many more factors, but muscle fiber type is just one we have a lot of information on. And like you say, most of the things correlate with it. So it's a nice, it's like the prototypical factor of something that is actually influenced by many more factors. And I think based on these factors, it's useful to use intensities rather than weights, especially when you're going up to the ends of the hypertrophy zone, which is indeed, like, I usually say 3 to 30 reps, but probably 3 to 5 to around 30 reps. Because if you program, say, 20 or 30 reps for someone, and that person is very fast twitch, then, or that muscle group more specifically, then that person may actually not be, or that person may actually need to go below, say, 30% of 1 RM to be able to do 30 reps because they are so fast twitch. So they may actually be working below the ideal hypertrophy zone. And other people may actually only be able to do with like 85% of 1 RM, which is like the bottom end of the hypertrophy zone probably. They may only be able to do 3 reps. And there was actually a recent study as well that, which is really interesting, also I think this month, that looked at tempo differences and time under tension. And they found that as long as the load is high enough and the time under tension is high enough, just 1 to 2 reps per set can suffice for nearly, or the same muscle growth as doing like sets of 10 with a normal tempo. And their tempo in the 1 or 2 repetition group was actually like a 30-second concentric and then like a double 30-second eccentric. So it was like 90-second reps, which was like, even Mike Menser would call that super slow. But it suffices that as long as the load and the time under tension are high enough, that low amount of repetitions can suffice. So, in practice, nobody does this, but it's interesting. So I think there is something to be said to using intensities, and I think you can also get an idea of this, which I do with all my clients in first test workouts. I have them determine something close to their 1 RM, and then have them reduce the weight a lot. There's another recent study that finds that the more you reduce the weight, the better you get an idea of the muscle's mechanical properties. So you have them do ideally a 1 RM, and then with like 50% or 40% of 1 RM, like literally the ends, like their maximal strength 1 RM, and like the low end of the hypertrophy zone, ideally. It doesn't work for squats. You have to be a bit more moderate there. But ideally, you look at the far extremes of the strength endurance spectrum that is relevant to use in practice, and then you see how many reps they can do with each and how big the difference is. For 1 RM, it's going to be 1 rep, but at 3 RM, you have to convert that to 1 RM. And you can basically estimate, you can do an estimated 1 RM based on the two ends, see which is higher, and that is where they should be stronger. You can also look at differences between muscle groups and stuff to see where, basically get an idea of which intensity they are relatively stronger at than average. And probably that's also where they're going to respond best. So if, like Mike says, you're doing like super low rep work and it's not working out at all, and super high rep work also doesn't work, but you feel super great, and probably your performance is also best in like the 6 to 10 rep zone, now that is indeed probably like the zone you're going to respond best to. Now, in aggregate, most research finds that it doesn't matter. If you lump all the individuals together, anything between like 5 and 30 reps roughly is going to result in the same growth. But I think there is something there to say that some individuals respond better to these intensity ranges, and I think it corresponds to what they are strongest at.
I'd like to point out a big drawback of such research. By the way, super, super awesome stuff that you said, Menno. That kind of research, when you take a study of, like, say, 12 weeks and you compare two groups, one that does sets of 5, one that does sets of 25, and you equate the volume, you do, in fact, get roughly the same amount of growth. Now, the next question becomes was the group of 5 maximizing slower twitch fiber growth? And the answer is almost certainly they weren't. But they were maximizing faster twitch fiber growth. And then you asked the same question for the other group, and with a 25 rep group probably did a good job at slower twitch fiber growth, but not the best job at faster twitch fiber growth. So you're basically getting sort of a Venn diagram situation where perhaps a Bayesian analysis, I tried. Anyway, so you basically get the situation where you're getting 2 suboptima, and you are basically saying, okay, well, yeah, both are equal, but both may be equivalently not the best. Now, there's a recent study that I think either Schoenfeld did or he summarized, where they had a more spectrum of rep ranges approach, and it actually resulted in considerably more growth than either polarity by itself. Now, is it the answer to say that that amount of growth could sort of peter out, and over 12 weeks or 16 weeks it would be a sort of all wash? Is the approach to do a periodized one where you do lower-ish reps for a couple of months and then higher-ish reps for a couple of months? One goes to maintenance, one goes to actual improvement, and then flip-flop them? I don't know. But I think that those studies that compare the very, very big rep range differences and just 1 rep here and compare, I think they're missing out on potentially higher growth from including more diverse rep ranges, as at least that one study with Schoenfeld showed. But I think there's just a very good theoretical basis for thinking that. So I don't want people to go too far in those studies and think, I could just do sets of 5 and it covers all my bases. Like, that's a really good way to go. But I think doing both, whether you do them both split by 2 or 3 months, or whether you do them in the same session or the same week, I think some justice to those broader intensity ranges is good, which I kind of describe sort of the distribution. Like, most of your work should occur to where your muscles are best performing, fiber type, so on. But I think some spreading out of the work to the shit you don't even like to do is good, just to dot the I's and T's. I think that specifically benefits people who are more advanced. Like, if you're an advanced bodybuilder and you want to be on stage, I think, who gives a shit if you grow these little slow twitch muscle fibers add like 2% total to your appearance? Well, you do, because 2% can be the difference between first place and 5th place. So I think there's still a really good description there, for that sort of thing. What do you guys think about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the individual literature on like the effect of training intensity on muscle fiber type specific growth is very, very conflicted. I think there was early Russian research which was quite clear that said, like, if you do super high reps, you're going to grow the type 1 fibers more. If you're going to do super low rep work, you're going to grow the type 2 fibers more. Many individual studies, Western studies, have not found this. Like, even like high rep work, and they've done biopsies, like type 1 and 2 fibers get the same growth. But a meta-analysis that I'm not sure if it's published yet already, actually, by Brad Schoenfeld, or at least he was co-author, found that there is a trend at like 90% and 30% to get fiber type specific growth. So there's definitely an argument there for periodization of rep ranges and undulating periodization.
At least an inclusion of all of them, however you go about including them. You could undulate them through the week, you do them in the same workout, you could do them 3 months apart. But I think it's just like, if you've been training for years, sets of 8, and you've gotten great results, and someone's like, have you ever tried sets of 15? You're like, why the fuck would I do that? Like, there might be a good reason, not a great reason, to maybe try some of that shit some of the time.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. And I think that the best research we have on this, what's most relevant for practical purposes, is that if you look at a research review by Fry, it's been a long time ago, still uncontested, I think, that looked at bodybuilders, powerlifters, and weightlifters, and they found that the bodybuilders were much bigger. No surprise there. And that was mostly because the powerlifters and the weightlifters had a lot of growth in the type 2 fibers, but the bodybuilders also had a lot of growth in the type 1 fibers. So you're going to get very strong, and you can make very good progression if all you're doing is heavy training. But if you want maximum muscle growth, you're probably also going to have to spend some time on the type 1 fibers. And I think the way to go about that is higher rep work and higher volumes. So I think there is definitely a good argument to be made for that.
Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that first part of individualization with Mike and Menno, going over some terrific things, and you've got much more content to enjoy in 5 episodes. So this will be episode 130 for the second part. Stay tuned till then. Cheers guys, and revive stronger.